Hello, my Agony Aunties. We have a question about imposter syndrome. Dear Agony Aunties, I've recently been promoted at work, and while I should feel proud, all I can think about is how unqualified I am and how I'm going to get found out. I know I'm not alone in feeling like a fraud, but how do I actually start believing I can do it?
I really feel this question. I've definitely had this feeling a lot.
Doing the podcast.
Yes, actually, no.
No.
That's more me. That's more me.
Yeah.
I don't feel unqualified to do the podcast because it's like that. You don't really need like a qualification anyway. Podcast, but I really recognize that thing of like your logical brain is saying, I didn't pretend to be anything other than I am. They know like my qualifications. I haven't faked anything, and yet somehow I feel like I don't belong here, that I'm going to be found out. So I really understand that feeling. And I you don't say whether you're male or female, but it does make me think of, that Sheryl Sandberg book where she writes about how in job applications, then men apply if they can do like 60% of the things that are sort of listed on the job requirements, and women need to feel like they can do 100% of the things in order to feel
So they're overqualified before they apply.
So they're sort of already going in feeling like maybe not sure that they're able to do it, kind of thing. But it honestly does help me just to sort of remind myself the logical part of like, I just am who I am. I haven't faked any kind of qualifications. I haven't pretended anything. And just sort of holding on to that, I think, can be quite just grounding.
And what that brings up for me is that often we want our emotions to match our thinking, and we can't always make our emotions match our thinking. And that can kind of drive us mad. But sometimes when we can hold both, that we feel this and we think that, and allow them side by side. And I think one of the particular ways of helping yourself when there's that kind of split with imposter syndrome is beginning to look for patterns. Like, what are the times, what are the conversations that you kind of recognize you particularly then have that very critical voice?
Right, because it might have come from a long time ago.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was thinking, was that I think often when we have strong voices like that, they're trying to play a sort of protective role in our lives. Like, I'm going to try and keep you safe by keeping you in positions where you don't feel a fool of yourself, but as a result, they're also trying to keep you in smaller spaces, in safer spaces. So I think it can be sometimes helpful to think of that as a part or as a voice rather than all of who you are. So
Name it, don't be it.
Yeah, so this is a bit of me that's trying to keep me safe, that's trying to protect me from embarrassing myself, or it's sort of playing a protective role. Maybe it's a protective role you've had in the past. Did you try and keep yourself quiet or smaller for some reason in your family dynamic or at school? Most of us have a critical voice, so that's not necessarily the case. But to allow other voices in, so they can be the part that says, oh, you're not really up to the job. And then there can be other voice being, like Emily said, being like, but I do have the qualifications to be here, or they chose me. So they chose me to be here. And that they can run alongside each other.
I think what's really helpful is, we've said many times on the podcast, where your attention is where you get your outcome. Look for the times that you feel more confident. Look for the times that you feel good, and kind of consciously, actively let those in. And so then with your idea of the different parts, you're kind of developing a configuration of parts, and all have a voice, but one doesn't have to knock the other one out.
But one of the answers that I thought when I looked at the question was like, partly it's just by doing it.
Yeah.
Like, as someone who definitely has found the podcast scary, I also did a talk and an event for a small charity in London on the weekend that I was terrified of doing because I'd never really done a talk on my own before. And it definitely is something about having done something. I think before we did our first ever event at the Freud Museum, together as the podcast, I was sitting in the kitchen journey, and I just couldn't stop crying. Just cry. Not like sobbing, just like slowly fearful tears rolling down my face.
Do you remember the tube?
And now we did the second event, and I did a third event on Monday. And while beforehand I think, fucking hate this. I am not crying before the events. So that, doing it is, does help.
I remember when I was training at Metanoia, and this is slightly annoying, but I think there's truth in it, is that they would say, reframe your doubt or your criticism as your growing edge, that where you're not sure of yourself is also the place that you can learn from. So you can kind of use that as a signal to be open to yourself for more learning, and that is a useful insight, and that we only learn from discomfort, from those kind of difficult edges.
Yeah, and which made me think of one other thing, which is, I don't know if this study is still, out there and is valid, but I really remember learning about how the idea that when they did research into stress, it was only when you believed that stress was bad for you that it was bad for you. And when you believed that stress was good for you, it was actually quite good for you.
That's true, unless it's like chronic toxic
Unless it's chronic toxic stress. We're talking about sort of
like exam stress or job stress.
Discrete event stress, right? And I definitely have held on to that for me. And I'd say it to my kids sometimes too, is the idea that if I reframe it in my head as, this is my body getting ready. This is a state of anticipation, because that's what my body is supposed to do when something new comes along. It wants to be ready. It wants to be alert. It wants to be ready to take action. And this is kind of an adaptive response to a new novel, and therefore, and it's sort of thinking of it as anticipation rather than as fear or getting ready. It helps the story in my head about what those sensations, because it's also the story we make about the sensations around the feeling that make the difference. When you're new in a job, you're going to be full of anticipation.
Okay.
You are new. That's your identity in that moment, as a new person in a new situation. It is natural to feel that energy in your body, that sense of anticipation, that kind of ready and alert. I'm learning, this is new.
And maybe I don't know what I'm doing.
And I don't, But I guess
I genuinely can't be
but it makes,
expected to.
I guess it makes sense that if you're talking about reframing, you can be like, this makes sense that my body has these sensations to get ready for a new situation so I can learn and be alert, rather than I'm telling the story of my body being very frightened.
So I hope that's useful. And I love Sophie, who never wants to say anything at the beginning and then you can't shut her up at the end.
I'm a slow burner, okay? I'm sure there's other listeners out there who can relate.
Yeah.